So I think the first slide to begin with is just to maybe give an introduction, which of course he has done, what this period is all about. This period is basically the period between 3 weeks before and 3 weeks after calving. That is what we term transition periods. So like Dr. Kare was talking about it earlier on, it is the most important periods. And if you want to you know, like he was saying in his farm, whenever he gets into his farm, he has too many areas of interest. Alisema ni gani na gani? Calves and the freshly calved. Yeah, so basically it's the most important period, and you find that this particular period has so many challenges. And like it's saying, this is the most challenging and critical period in relation to dairy cows, the health status during the entire lactation cycle. So you find that in this particular period, that 6 weeks period, you find that major physiological, nutritional, metabolic, immunological changes normally occur within that time frame. So it tells you that if that time is not properly managed, then you are going to lose so many things in terms of production and all the other parameters that Dr. Kara was talking about. When we are trying to look at you know, the catalog, trying to interpret the catalog, there are so many important parameters and aspects ambayo alikuwa anafanya nini, anawaeleza, si ndio? So if you don't manage this period well, then some of those parameters you are likely going to not to benefit from them. So that is what makes this period the most important period in the life of especially a dairy cow. So we want to now look at the major challenges or the major conditions that are normally associated with this period. And I know many of us, we know about them, but sometimes how we normally do the management, the actual management is normally the problem. Sometimes we assume. Cynthia? So my main objective here is just to let you know that that assumption is costing you money. That is my main target, okay? So now the first condition that is basically associated with this period is what we call calcium imbalance, okay? And just to try to dig deeper a little bit for your understanding, you find that during the calving period, you find that dry cows, they normally have that sudden and extreme demand for calcium. Basically targeting two things. Number one is the initiation of lactation. So for the cow to now begin giving you milk, that actual process is initiated by the availability of what? Of this calcium. Similarly, remember that when the cow is just moving towards your period of maturation, remember that the last trimester, that is the last 3 months, you find that the cow normally uses a lot of calcium for the purposes of the development of the fetus. The fetus normally grows at an average of 0.8 kilos per day in the last trimester. So that normally really needs a lot of calcium for that to happen, because we need bone mineralization and also actual body physiological functions of the calf and all that. Because in the next few weeks, the calf will be born. It needs to be strong enough. It needs to be moving and all that. You see? So for the purposes of the initiation of lactation and also for the purposes of proper development of the fetus, this is why there is that sudden demand for that calcium. Okay? Now, normally under normal circumstances, the body has a way of regulating what we call calcium hemostasis. Venye huwa mwili inafanya nini? Inatengeneza hiyo calcium kivyake. But because of this sudden demand for this calcium, it is now extraordinary. They normally say that extraordinary times call for extraordinary what? Measures. So that is what actually is happening here. Normally, under normal circumstances, the body will just do what we call normal calcium hemostasis. Inajitengenezea calcium. But this period, because it's a very, very special one, it calls for extraordinary what? Measures. That is why it's a very, very important aspect to really look at. So now this creates a situation where the mechanism of calcium hemostasis is basically under great stress, and that is why it becomes a very, very important aspect to look at. Then also remember that now we have normally the lower limits and the upper limits. So what normally happens if because of the initiation of lactation, ikienda below the lower limit, then it triggers the normal calcium hemostasis. So ng'ombe inaweza kufanya nini? Kujitengenezea its own calcium. But because of that sudden demand, when the body is now not able to give enough calcium to the body, then now deficiency sets in. Okay? When the deficiency sets in, what happens next? the cow now begins to manifest some signs. Okay, that is normally called now the likes of milk fever and all that, which we shall discuss in the next few slides. So this is what normally happens under normal circumstances. So how the body normally does it under normal circumstances, we find that this is just some complex science, which I may not really explain to you, but you find that there's an hormone here that is normally being triggered called the PTH hormone. It acts on the kidneys, then the kidneys release another hormone again, which acts on the surface of the bones and also on the intestines to sequester calcium. Then it gets into the system of the body, then the animal becomes normocalcemic. This is the normal thing. So don't worry about it. There's a lot of science. What you should worry about is this. The first thing that will happen is that the animal will suffer from hypocalcemia, or what is commonly called milk fever. So when now the body is not able to sustain the calcium demand for the initiation of lactation, then it shows the symptoms of calcium deficiency, commonly called milk fever. Okay? So this is how it will present. I'm sure in your farms you've seen one fine morning animal behaving like this. Is it true or false? One fine morning tunashangaa tu ng'ombe inakaa hivi. So you begin wondering if iweze simama, it cannot eat, it's now having so many other issues. So this is how it normally happens under normal circumstances. But now we have 3 stages. These are the 3 main stages. The first stage is normally what we call the prodromal stage. And this is where we want to actually act, because the prognosis or the ability for it to respond to calcium supplementation is quite high. Many a times we wait until the second stage, ambaye now we call it the stage of sternal recumbency. Unapata kwamba now the neck inaenda kwa flank ya ng'ombe. So when we wait to this particular point, now the prognosis is actually about 75%, 25%. Okay? Then when it goes to the last stage, what we call the stage of lateral recumbency, now the prognosis is actually guarded. It's about 25%, 75%. So most likely it might not respond. Now if you figure this last stage, then most likely the animal might even die. I don't know kama kwenu maybe mshawaona ng'ombe zime succumb because of calcium deficiency. It normally happens. And it will happen if you don't do the management protocols to the point whereby inafika this last stage. Sawa. So we want to actually act in the first or the second, but most preferably the first one, so that now the response to treatment or supplementation is quite high, and we are sure that the animal will respond to calcium supplementation. So we want to act in the first stage, the stage of sternal recumbency, and not the stage of lateral recumbency. So you don't want your animals to reach this stage. So when you can actually target to manage it at the earliest stage as possible. So now what makes this condition very, very unique, and that's why we really wanted to talk about it, is that when you have hypocalcemia, then it normally opens the door to several other metabolic conditions that he was just briefly talking about when he was introducing this topic. So this is what now makes hypocalcemia a very dangerous thing. And many farmers, when you actually ignore to do the needful, then you open the door to so many other complications, which actually will now deny you the money that as a farmer you are looking for. So it is called gateway disease, which we want to discuss in the next few minutes. So this diagram just simply tells us what normally happens. So in a nutshell, you find that when the animal has milk fever, because I've told that now calcium is very, very important for the initiation of lactation, therefore it is an extraordinary time. Okay? So what happens if it is not properly managed, then the animal comes up or comes down with milk fever, then this will happen. Number one, the animal will have an issue with immune function, because, muscle function, because for the muscles to function, they need calcium as part of muscle contraction and relaxation. For the muscle to relax and contract, it needs calcium. That's the first thing. Already, the animal has low calcium. So what do we expect? The muscles will be weak. Then if the muscles are weak, then what happens next? This is what will happen next. So what happens next, that there will be an issue with what we call rumen and GIT motility. So what happens is, when the animal eats, ikikula chakula, hiyo chakula ikiingia pale kwa rumen, the rumen is normally motile. Motile simply means it is in the process of movement up and down, okay? So that movement of the rumen up and down is under the influence of calcium. If the calcium is low, then rumen motility is also slowed. I mean, it is low. Okay. So what will happen is that when the animal now consumes that particular food, whichever fodder it will eat, then when we have insufficient rumen motility, it will affect so many other things. Number one, that whatever will happen is, number one, it will affect appetite. And that is why you find that when we have issues with the milk fever, the animal also will have an issue with appetite. Okay, already there is issue with rumen motility. Are we together? So when the appetite is affected, what next will happen? The animal will have low feed intake or insufficient feed intake. Okay, when we have insufficient feed intake, then what will happen next is that the animal will now suddenly get into stage of what we call hypoglycemia. Glycogen, that means energy, isn't it? So there is low energy because of insufficient feed intake. The animal is having low appetite. Okay? So what happens is, so the animal has low appetite. Now the animal gets into state of negative energy balance. That is number one. And when we have state of negative energy balance, then you remember that this animal has just calved down. Now it needs a lot of energy for the purposes of also initiation of lactation. Kupatile maziwa, it needs energy, isn't it? Apart from calcium, it also needs energy for the initiation of lactation. So what will happen is, when now the animal feels that now I need a lot of energy, also need a lot of calcium now to give you the milk, what will happen is that the animal now starts to look for that energy elsewhere. Are we together? Now what it will do, it will now start to eat its own what? Body reserves. Na ikifika hapo, then you've lost the war. Are we together? Ukialao ng'ombe ifikisha hapo, you've lost the war. Because what will happen, now the metabolic condition starts to set in now. One of them that some of you maybe are not very much aware of is what he was saying, talking about, that is ketosis. Are we together? So when ketosis sets in, then ketosis is actually a metabolic condition which normally is characterized by decrease in milk production and also loss in body condition score. So now if you remember the parameter that Dr. Kare was mentioning here, one of them is that you don't want to serve a very thin animal because of low conception and issues with infertility. So one of the things that you'll find out is that when the animal suffers ketosis, then even the number of times that, or it will actually elongate the time that it takes to next calving. That calving interval, it will be elongated. So again, you're losing on production. For you to be able to get that one calf every year, haitakuwa, because it will take a very, very long time for the animal to return to cyclicity. Then again, there's another very, very close associate of ketosis, which is now fatty liver disease. They normally come together. In fact, when you have ketosis, there are very, very high chances of you also having issues with fatty liver disease. Then finally, there will be now an issue with decreased production, because remember, like some of you were talking about issues with hormone synchronization and all that. Remember, for the hormones to be produced, some of them are being produced in the brain, in the hypothalamus, then they act in the anterior pituitary gland. That process, it needs energy. So for the hormones metabolism, hormonal metabolism to actually take place, inataka energy. Na hiyo energy already iko chini. So what will happen? The animal will have an issue with returning back to cyclicity ama to estrus. Yani inachukua muda mrefu ndio yaze kushow the next sign of heat. Are we together? So again, when that happens, what will happen to production? What will happen is that it will take a very, very long time for you to be able to serve the animal, and therefore you will not achieve your target of one calf every. So the problem started with milk fever. That's why I was saying that this is a gateway disease. Tukishaelewa hii slide, then karibu ninamaliza tu. Tunaelewana hapo? So ilianzia wapi? Milk fever. And sometimes what you need to understand is that milk fever has two forms. The first form is what we call subclinical form of milk fever. Subclinical means, will you see the dalili? Dalili haiko. You will not see the dalili of milk fever, but it is there. And it is doing all these things. So it's doing all these things in the background because it is subclinical. We are not seeing it. Are we together? Then we now have the clinical form, whereby now the animal will be recumbent, alafu inakata maziwa, shingo inaweka kwa flanks. That's now the clinical form. So what is dangerous, what is most dangerous is the subclinical one. That now becomes the gateway disease, whereby all these things are happening in the background. Unaelewana hapo? So it is denying you profits, denying you a calf. Sawa sawa. Similarly, when we have an issue with insufficient feed intake, then what will happen is we have what we call rumen fill. Many of you, I know you feed your animals. Sometimes you can get high value nutritional products that you give to your animals. But still, even if you give very high value nutrition to your animals, still we'll advise you that ensure that you give some bit of roughages. For what? For rumen fill. Why is the rumen fill important? Number one, it initiates rumination. Number two, that rumen fill is very, very important to maintain the anatomy of the digestive system. It's important to initiate rumination, regurgitation and all that. That is the rumination process. Ikuje tena ichiuchiu irudishe that process. Then number two, ina maintain the anatomy of the four stomachs ya ng'ombe. Now this normally happens immediately after paturation because you find that the animal already kuna insufficient feed intake. So that means that now when the rumen is not filled, then ni kama unafungua mlango for what we call displacement of the abomasum. Hiyo kitu mnaelewanga hiyo kitu? Displaced abomasum. Mshawaisikia hiyo? Ama tu daktari amekuja alafu anaitibu anatoroka tu. So it's a very, very common thing. Normally when the rumen is filled, then it maintains the anatomy of the four stomachs. When we have insufficient feed intake and therefore the rumen is not filled, then predispose the four stomachs into an issue whereby now it comes up with displaced abomasum, which we don't want to happen. Similarly, when we have insufficient feed intake, then we have low levels of energy and therefore there is immediate sharp decrease in milk yields. That is why when we have milk fever, it will also be accompanied by decrease in milk production. Then I'm moving very, very fast. Remember again, milk fever has a direct correlation with the immune function or immune system. So what will happen is that when we have an issue with low immune function, then predispose hiyo ng'ombe to high chances of it getting what? Mastitis. So we have high prevalence of mastitis. Again, when we have issues with low immune function, then it also has direct correlation with the reproduction and therefore fertility issues. Again, when we have an issue with the low immune function, then again predisposed to metritis, especially after paturation. What he was telling you kwamba one of the good principles of managing freshly calved cows, whenever they have kama watazaa today, in the next 2 days you need to inject the hormone hii inaitwa enzaprost because it's a PGF, natural PGF, so that zile remnants za the fetal membranes zilibaki pale ndani zinakuwa expelled and therefore it attracts the cells that fight that come and fight all those infections in the uterus, then respond quite fast. Are we together? So what will happen is that when we have low immune function and therefore the immune cells ziko na challenges, then itakuwa na issue na metritis. Tunaelewana hapo? Now similarly, when we have an issue with metritis, then we have an issue with what we call uterine involution. Your involution is what we say is that we try to return that the normal anatomical shape of that uterus to kama ilikuwa kubwa, ndio inafaa ifanye nini? Ishrink, irudi back to normal. That's what we call uterine involution. So when we have metritis, ama infection of the uterus, then it will take long for the involution to take place. When that happens, then again you are also losing on fertility. Are we together? Na ilikuwa imeanzia wapi? Milk fever. Then again, for the issues of now the teats, I heard you having a discussion about the teats and all that. So the teat iko na segments zake. We have the teat orifice, we have the sphincter muscles, then we have the teat the teat orifice, the teat sphincter muscles and all that. So remember now we have a special muscle upper juu that we call the teat sphincter muscle. This muscle is what prevents the milk from ile inatirika at any time it wants unless it is triggered. Are we together? Now these sphincter muscles, kama kuna issues na low calcium, it will affect muscle function, and one of the functions or one of the muscles ambayo inakuwa affected is the stit sphincter muscles. Unaelewana hapo? So this muscle inafaa ina relax wakati unafanya milking, and within 7 to 8 seconds post milking inafaa imefanya nini? Imerudi. Are we together? 8 seconds after milking. So what will happen is that after milking, what will happen is that this sphincter muscle will remain patent for long because there is low calcium. So it will remain patent for a long time, then inapata ya kwamba now whichever germs that might be in the environment, it will gain entrance through the teat canal into the quarter, and then that quarter becomes infected with microorganisms, and therefore mastitis sets in. So everything starts up here. Na kuna vitu mingi sijasema hapa, like dystocia, retained fetal membranes, uterine motility, and all those things. But the bottom line is that when we have an issue with milk fever, then it becomes a gateway disease. What many farmers don't know is that when we have subclinical form of milk fever is where it becomes dangerous. We will not see it, we will not test for it, but it is doing all these things. Are we together? So all this happens in the transition period.